So I've had my weather app open more than usual this week, which is generally not a great sign, and every time I check it, there's another little red triangle sitting over some part of Europe I've actually been to. Which is the kind of detail that makes a story feel a lot less abstract and a lot more, oh, that's the train station I stood in 2 summers ago in a t-shirt, having a perfectly normal time. Anyway, that's roughly how this topic landed on my desk, and I want to take a proper long wander through it tonight, because there is quite a lot going on. Some of it is just numbers and weather systems, the kind of thing that's genuinely fascinating if you're into that, and I am, sorry in advance. And some of it is sadder, about real people living through this right now, and I want to handle that part with the care it deserves rather than turning it into a spectacle, because it isn't one. What's actually happening, in the broadest possible strokes, is that large parts of Europe have spent the back half of June absolutely cooking, in a way that's broken a startling number of temperature records, and has, very sadly, killed a lot of people. We're going to go through the records properly country by country, because some of them are wild. We'll talk about what a heat dome actually is and why it traps heat the way it does. We'll talk gently about the people this has affected, and about how heat actually does what it does to a human body, which is more interesting and more unsettling than you'd think. And we're going back a fair way, to the summer that changed how an entire continent thinks about hot weather, because none of this makes proper sense without it. If you're new here, this is the kind of channel where I just talk through a topic for a good long while. No big dramatic reveals, no countdown clock, nothing you need to stay awake for. Stick around for 5 minutes or the whole thing, doesn't matter to me, it's built to work either way. If you fancy subscribing for more of this sort of meandering deep dive, the button's there, no pressure though. Right, let's get into it properly. Let me set the scene, because there isn't just one heat wave this year. There have actually been 2, and I think that detail gets lost in the headlines a bit. The first one turned up in late May, which on its own is worth pausing on. Heatwaves in May are not really a thing Europe has historically had to think about. But this one arrived with temperatures running 10 to 15 degrees above what's normal for the time of year, and it was, by most measures, the hottest spring on record across a chunk of the continent. Records for May itself fell in country after country. It was the sort of event that, 10 years ago, would have been the entire story for the summer. This year, it was basically the warm-up act. Then, a few weeks later, just before the summer solstice, the real one arrived. This second heatwave started around the middle of June, and it has been, by a fair margin, the more severe of the 2. This is the one you've probably seen on the news. This is the one with the red maps and the closed schools and the cancelled events. I find it useful to think of it almost like weather moving across a stage, because that's what it did. It started in the west. France and Spain and Portugal got hit first, and hit hard. Météo France, the French National Weather Service, confirmed that one particular day toward the end of June was the hottest day the country has recorded since they started properly measuring these things, back in 1947. Not the hottest June day, the hottest day, full stop, in just under 80 years of records. There was a town in the southwest, Pissos, that hit a temperature in the mid-40s, the kind of number you'd expect to see in a much hotter part of the world. We'll get into the exact figures properly in a minute because there's a lot to unpack there, but I wanted to give you a sense of scale early on. From there, the heat didn't really stop, it just relocated. Over the following days it drifted east, the way these systems tend to, sliding across Germany, into Poland, down through Austria, Switzerland, Hungary, Croatia. Practically the whole middle of the continent took a turn under it. By the time it reached Germany, the country's National Weather Service was calling it historic, which is a fairly strong word for an organisation whose entire personality is measured calm. What I think is strange about this event, if you sit with it for a moment, is the sheer geographic sweep of it. We're not talking about one country having a rough week. We're talking about a band of extreme heat that, across both waves, touched the UK, Ireland, France, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Poland, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Hungary, Slovenia, Croatia, and further still. That is most of a continent, more or less simultaneously, hitting numbers it has either never seen or hasn't seen in living memory. And there's a detail in there that I think matters more than it first appears, which is the timing. This wasn't August. It wasn't even properly July. A huge amount of this happened in the back half of June, before summer has even officially settled in for most of these countries. Scientists who study this stuff have pointed out that the early arrival of this kind of heat is itself a signal that the Central European summer is effectively starting earlier than it used to, which has knock-on effects for everything from how long the heat season lasts to how exhausted everyone is by the time August rolls around, so that's the shape of it. 2 heat waves, the second far worse than the first, sweeping west to east across a continent that, frankly, was not built with this in mind. We're going to come back to that not built with this in mind idea quite a lot tonight, because it threads through almost everything, from the houses people live in to the buses that couldn't charge their batteries in the Netherlands, which is an odd little detail we'll get to later. For now, though, I want to actually walk you through the numbers properly, country by country, because some of these records are the kind of thing that, even if you followed the headlines, are worth sitting with for a second. There's something almost hypnotic about a list of broken records, in a strange way, so let's do that next. There's a list of records here that can either be deeply boring or weirdly compelling, and I'm going to do my best to make it the second one. Let's start in the United Kingdom, partly because it's where I'm sat and partly because it had a genuinely strange run of records, breaking its own number twice in about 24 hours. The country logged its hottest June day ever recorded, then promptly beat that figure again the following day, with a new high landing in a village in Somerset. 2 records, back to back, like the weather couldn't quite decide which day deserved the title more. The Met Office, who are not known for dramatic language, called it a 10 times more likely event because of climate change, which is the sort of sentence that sounds dry until you actually think about what it means. France, as we touched on, had its hottest day in the full run of its records, not just for June, going back to 1947. Beyond that headline day, the southwest of the country, around Bordeaux, sat in the low 40s for what felt like an unreasonable stretch of time, and the national average temperature, which is a clever measurement that blends day and night readings from stations right across the country, also broke its own record. That average figure matters more than it sounds like it should, because it captures something a single hot afternoon doesn't, which is that the whole country was baking at once, not just one unlucky valley. Germany had maybe the most dramatic individual story of the lot, in the sense that it broke its all-time national heat record on 3 separate days in a row. 3. Like the country kept setting a new personal best, and then immediately beating it again before anyone could properly celebrate. A small town near the Polish border ended up holding the new high. And across the whole country, weather stations with 100+ years of continuous data, the proper old reliable ones, logged their highest readings ever, some of them by margins of 3 or 4 degrees, which in climate terms is enormous. That's not a record being nudged. That's a record being smashed. Spain and Portugal got hit hardest and hit earliest because of where they sit geographically, right in the path of hot air coming up off the Sahara. Andújar, down in southern Spain, reached temperatures that belong in a different climate zone entirely. Portugal saw similar numbers up near Pinho. Both countries also broke their own May records before the second, bigger wave had even arrived, which tells you something about how the whole season has been shaped, not just this one fortnight. The Netherlands had a particularly satisfying story, in a nerdy sort of way, because their old June record had stood since 1947, the same year as the French benchmark, oddly enough, and it finally fell this year by a noticeable margin. I'll be honest, there's something I quite like about a record that stood for nearly 80 years finally going. It has a sort of changing of the guard feeling to it, even when the news attached to it is grim. Denmark broke its all-time national record, not just a June or summer record, the whole thing, which for a country that thinks of itself as fairly temperate is a strange milestone to hit. And then further east, as the heat dome shifted, Poland and the Czech Republic both logged provisional all-time highs. Hungary set a new June record near Budapest. Austria did the same in Vienna, with the capital still under a red alert as the numbers came in. Slovenia had station-setting new June marks too. It's basically a continuous chain, country after country, each one getting its turn under the same slow-moving weather system. I want to flag one number that I think gets a bit lost in all this, which is that in Germany alone, over 250 separate weather stations recorded an all-time high during this event. Not just a hot day. Their highest reading ever, at that specific station, since records at that station began, 250. That's not a fluke at one unlucky spot, that's the entire measuring network getting outrun at once. If you zoom out even further, there's a stat that puts the whole decade in perspective, which is that since 2010, 18 separate European countries have recorded their highest ever temperature. 18. Not 18 records broken by the same handful of countries, 18 different nations, each independently hitting their own personal worst or best, depending how you want to frame it, in the space of about 15 years. I think what strikes me, going through this list, is how unevenly satisfying it is. Some of these are dramatic single-day spikes, a number that flashes red for an afternoon and then drops away. Others, like Germany's 3-day streak or that 250 station figure, feel more like a sustained system failure than a single event. It's the difference between a thermometer having a bad moment and an entire continent's climate shifting under everyone's feet, while they're standing on it. Anyway, that's the tour. There's obviously a temptation, once you've got a list like that in front of you, to ask the obvious question, which is whether any of this actually means Europe has just recorded the hottest temperature in its history. Full stop, no asterisks. And the honest answer to that is a bit more interesting and a bit more complicated than the headlines tend to let on. Okay, so here's a bit of a myth-busting moment, and I quite enjoy these, so bear with me. When you see a headline like, Europe just recorded its hottest temperature in history, what's actually being measured matters a lot, and most of the time, what's being broken is a national record, or a record for a specific month, rather than the actual all-time highest temperature ever measured anywhere on the continent. Those are different things, and the difference is worth understanding because it changes how you read every single one of these stories from now on. The genuine, currently standing continental record for the highest temperature ever reliably measured in mainland Europe is 48.8 degrees, recorded near a town called Floridia in Sicily, back in August 2021. And I say reliably measured very deliberately, because the World Meteorological Organization, which is the body that adjudicates these things internationally, didn't just take that number and run with it. They sent an international panel of scientists to investigate. They had the actual sensor that recorded the reading shipped off to a metrology institute in Italy to be independently tested and recalibrated to make absolutely sure the equipment itself hadn't malfunctioned or drifted. That process took 3 years. 3 years to confirm one number, which I think says something rather nice about how seriously this stuff gets taken, even when the conclusion seems, on the face of it, fairly obvious. Before that Sicilian reading was confirmed, the record had belonged to Greece since July 1977, when both Athens and a nearby town called Elefsina hit 48.0 degrees on the same day. That record stood for 44 years, which is a long reign for a weather record, and it makes sense when you think about where Greece sits, right on the southeastern edge of the continent exposed to hot air drifting in from North Africa and the Middle East. It's one of Europe's natural heat poles, geographically speaking the place you'd expect a record like that to live. There's also an older, slightly murkier figure floating around, an unofficial reading of 50 degrees in Seville, back in 1881. I mention it mostly because it's a fun bit of trivia, but it doesn't carry the same weight as the Sicily or Athens readings, because the verification standards from the 1880s are, understandably, nothing like what we have now. So it sits in the record books more as a curiosity than a genuine benchmark. So, with all that in mind, has this year's heatwave actually broken that 48.8 degree continental record? As far as the confirmed data goes, no, it hasn't. What it has done, repeatedly, and in a lot of places, is break national records, which is still an enormous deal, just a slightly different category of enormous. A German national record is not the same statistical claim as the European continental record, even though both will absolutely get described as hottest ever in a headline. Because frankly, both of those things are technically true within their own scope. I don't think this is me being pedantic for the sake of it, by the way. I actually think the nuance makes the story more interesting, not less. Because the more remarkable thing happening here isn't one single thermometer somewhere hitting an all-time continental peak. It's the sheer breadth of it. Remember that figure from a moment ago, the 250 German weather stations that each individually hit their own all-time high during this event? That's not one record. That's hundreds, simultaneously, across one country's measuring network. Multiply that pattern out across the dozen or so countries that also broke records this year, and you get something that statistically is arguably scarier than a single dramatic peak in Sicily, because it shows the heat isn't localized to one unlucky spot, it's structural, it's everywhere at once. There's a nice way to think about it that a climate scientist put to me once, in a different context, which is that record-breaking events used to be rare enough that you could treat each one as a genuine outlier, a one-off. What's changed isn't really that the outliers got more extreme, although they have, it's that they stopped being outliers. They became a pattern. We're going to talk properly about the climate science behind that shift a bit later on, because I think it deserves its own proper space rather than being squeezed in here as an aside. For now, I just wanted to get that distinction clear in your head, because it'll make the rest of tonight make a lot more sense. That Sicilian reading still holds the top spot for now at least. But almost everything else, every individual country's personal worst, has been getting rewritten at a pace that, frankly, even the scientists who study this stuff for a living seem a bit rattled by. I want to talk about why this actually happens, meteorologically speaking, because the mechanism behind it is fascinating, and it's the kind of thing that, once you understand it, you'll never read a heatwave forecast the same way again. I love this bit, genuinely, because the physics of it is one of those things that sounds almost too simple to be true, and yet it explains an enormous amount of human misery. What's been sitting over Europe this year, and what's sat over it during most of the worst heatwaves in recent memory, is something meteorologists call an omega block, named because the shape it makes on a pressure map looks roughly like the Greek letter omega, a big rounded arch with two dips on either side. It's a persistent area of high pressure that essentially gets stuck in place, wedged between two areas of lower pressure, and because it's so stable, it doesn't move on the way weather normally does. A normal system rolls through in a day or two. An omega block can sit there for a week, 2 weeks, sometimes longer, just parked over the same stretch of the map like an unwelcome houseguest, who's stopped mentioning when they're leaving. Here's the bit I find genuinely clever about how it works. Inside that dome of high pressure, air is slowly sinking, and as air sinks, it gets compressed. The same way a bicycle pump gets warm when you push the plunger down, and that compression heats the air up even further, on top of whatever heat it already arrived with. So you've effectively got two heating mechanisms stacked on top of each other. There's the actual source of the hot air to begin with, which in most of these European events has been a mass of dry air pulled up from the Sahara, dragged north on a southerly or southeasterly wind. And then there's the dome itself physically cooking that air further as it sinks and compresses inside the high-pressure system. And because the dome is sat there, stable, it also blocks out cloud cover, which means you get relentless unbroken sunshine baking the ground day after day, with nothing to interrupt it. No cooler air can punch its way in from the sides, because the high pressure is actively pushing it away. It's less like weather passing through, and more like a lid being placed over a saucepan. Now, the detail that I think actually matters most for understanding why this is so dangerous to people, rather than just uncomfortable, is what happens at night. Normally, even during a hot spell, temperatures drop after dark, the ground radiates heat back out, and your body gets a window to cool down, to recover a bit before the next day starts. But under one of these blocking systems, especially when the air is saturated with heat all the way through, that overnight drop barely happens. Meteorologists call these tropical nights, defined fairly simply as nights where the temperature never drops below 20 degrees. During this year's events, parts of Germany recorded overnight lows closer to 30 degrees, 30, at 3 in the morning. There is no recovery window in a night like that. Your body just keeps cooking slowly for 24 hours straight, day after day, with nowhere to come up for air. Humidity changes the picture too, in a way that's worth understanding properly. When the air is hot but fairly dry, your body can still cool itself reasonably well through sweating, because the sweat can actually evaporate off your skin, and that evaporation is what carries the heat away. But when humidity climbs, that evaporation slows down or stops altogether, and suddenly a temperature that would otherwise be merely unpleasant becomes something your body can't cope with. There's a rough rule of thumb that at around 35 degrees with humidity above 80%, it can feel, physiologically, closer to 50. We're going to get properly into the biology of why that happens in a bit, because I think it deserves a full section of its own. It's honestly one of the most interesting bits of the whole topic. There's one more layer to all this that I think is underappreciated, which is what cities do to the whole equation. It's called the urban heat island effect, and the basic idea is that all that concrete, tarmac and glass in a dense city soaks up heat through the day and then releases it slowly overnight, instead of letting it radiate away the way open countryside does. So a regional temperature of, say, 35 degrees can easily translate to 38 or 40 on an actual city street with no shade and no green space, and the nights that should offer some relief end up staying warmer than the surrounding countryside too, It's a bit like the city itself becomes a sort of low-grade storage heater that never properly switches off. So that's the mechanism, more or less. A stalled high-pressure system, sinking and compressing air on top of an already hot air mass pulled up from further south, blocking out clouds, refusing to budge, and then cities making the whole thing worse on top of that. It's not a particularly exotic piece of physics, if I'm honest. It's almost embarrassingly simple once you lay it out. But the consequences of that simple mechanism, when it sits in place for long enough, are anything but simple. Which brings me, gently, to the part of tonight I've been putting off a little, which is talking about the people this has actually affected. I want to slow down a bit for this part. Not because anything I'm about to tell you is graphic, it isn't, and I'm deliberately not going to dwell on details that don't need dwelling on. But these are real people. This is happening right now as I'm putting this together, and I think the least I can do is talk about it carefully, rather than rushing through it for the sake of pacing. The World Health Organization's Director General put out a figure that, more than anything else this year, became the number people actually talked about. More than 1,300 excess deaths recorded across Europe in the space of about a week. Excess deaths, if you haven't come across the term before, just means deaths above what you'd statistically expect for that time period, based on previous years. It's not always possible to say with total certainty that any one individual death was caused by the heat specifically, but when you see that many more people dying than usual, in the exact window a heat wave was happening, the pattern speaks for itself. The WHO's chief put it simply, saying that European homes, workplaces and schools simply weren't built for these kinds of temperatures, and honestly, that's a theme we're going to keep circling back to tonight, because it's true in almost every direction you look. France's Public Health Agency reported around 1,000 of those excess deaths on its own, concentrated heavily, as these things tend to be, among people over 65. I want to say something here that I think is worth sitting with, which is that this isn't really a story about old age being inherently fragile. It's more a story about who tends to be alone, who tends not to have someone checking in, who tends to live in a top-floor flat with no air conditioning and a window that doesn't open far enough. We'll get into exactly why that pattern exists a bit later, because there's a piece of history from over 20 years ago that explains it properly. For now, just sit with that number, 1,000 more deaths than usual, in one country in about a week. Spain's health monitoring system, which tracks daily mortality and compares it against historical averages, found over 400 deaths likely linked to the heat across just a 4-day stretch. For comparison, and I think this comparison does more work than the raw number does on its own, the equivalent period the previous year saw fewer than 100. Same 4 days of the calendar, same country, and a number that's roughly 4 times higher. That's the kind of gap that makes the abstract idea of a heatwave suddenly feel a lot less abstract. There are individual stories woven through all of this too, and I want to mention a few gently, because I think it's important not to let a death toll stay a pure statistic. A young footballer, just 21, playing for a French second division club, drowned in the Rhône while trying to cool off during the worst of the heat. His club put out a short statement saying they were saddened by his death, which is the sort of understated, ordinary sentence that somehow lands harder than anything more dramatic could. Drownings in general spiked badly this year, because when it's that hot, people understandably go looking for water. Rivers, canals, anywhere, and not everywhere is actually safe to swim. There were also several cases of young children left in hot cars, found too late by family members who had no idea the heat inside a parked vehicle climbs as fast as it does. I'm not going to go into the specifics of those cases because I don't think the details serve any purpose here beyond causing distress, but I do want to acknowledge that they happened, more than once, in more than one country, and that it's an underknown danger that deserves to be taken seriously by anyone driving with kids in the back during weather like this. And then there are the quieter deaths, the ones that don't make headlines on their own. Elderly residents in the southwest of France in their 80s and 90s who simply didn't survive the weekend the temperatures peaked. No drama, no single dramatic moment, just a body that couldn't keep up with conditions it had never had to cope with before. I think what I want to leave you with before we move on is this. A death toll when it's just a number on a screen is hard to feel anything about. It's too big, too abstract, the wrong shape for a human brain to process properly. But behind that number from this single week is a footballer who went for a swim because it was unbearably hot. Its elderly neighbours who lived 2 streets from each other and never knew the other one had died until someone went round to check. It's ordinary, completely understandable human behaviour: swimming, leaving a window open, falling asleep in a hot room, meeting conditions that, until startlingly recently, simply weren't part of what a normal European summer involved. I promise the rest of tonight isn't going to sit in this register the whole way through. There's plenty ahead that's properly fascinating rather than sad. But I wanted to give this part the weight it deserves before we move on to the science of why all this happens, biologically, inside an actual human body. Which, as it turns out, is a genuinely interesting story in its own right. Time to get into the biology, because this is one of the most interesting corners of the whole topic, and it's something most people, myself included until I started reading into this properly, don't actually understand in any detail. Your body, under normal circumstances, is extremely good at managing its own temperature. It runs at around 37 degrees, and it really wants to stay there, give or take a fraction. When you get hot, two main systems kick in to bring you back down. Blood vessels near the surface of your skin widen, sending more blood close to the surface so heat can radiate away from you, which is why you go red and flushed in warm weather, and you sweat, which cools you down through evaporation, the same way a wet towel cools your skin faster than a dry one. Both of those systems work brilliantly most of the time for most weather. The trouble starts when the air around you gets hot enough and humid enough that those systems stop being able to keep up. If the air temperature is close to or above your skin temperature, radiating heat away through your blood vessels stops working properly, because heat naturally flows from hot to cold, and if the air is no longer colder than you, that flow slows or even reverses. And if the humidity is high enough, sweat can't evaporate efficiently either, because the air is already holding as much moisture as it can take. When both of those fail at once, your core temperature starts climbing, and it doesn't really have anywhere to go but up. This is where heat stroke comes in, which is the most severe end of the spectrum. It's defined, properly, as your core body temperature climbing above 40 degrees, alongside symptoms affecting your central nervous system, confusion, disorientation, sometimes seizures, sometimes a full loss of consciousness. It's not a gradual, gentle decline. It can come on quickly, especially in people whose bodies are already working harder than normal. The elderly, people with existing heart or kidney conditions, people doing physical labour outdoors. Your heart in particular takes a real beating during all this, because it's trying to pump extra blood to your skin to help you cool down, while you're also losing fluid through sweat, which thickens your blood and makes the heart work harder still. It's a bit of a pincer movement on your cardiovascular system. Now, there's a measurement that scientists use to capture all of this properly, because air temperature alone doesn't tell the full story, and it's called wet bulb temperature. The idea is brilliantly simple once you understand it. You take a normal thermometer, the kind that measures regular air temperature, and you wrap the bulb in a damp cloth. As water evaporates off that cloth, it cools the thermometer down, the same way sweat cools your skin. So the reading you get, the wet bulb temperature, tells you how much cooling potential is actually available in the air around you, given both the heat and the humidity together. A low wet bulb reading means the air can still absorb a lot of moisture, so sweat evaporates easily, and your body can cool itself well. A high wet bulb reading means the air is already close to saturated, so sweat barely evaporates at all, and your body's main cooling mechanism essentially stops working. For a long time, the assumed danger threshold was a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees, the rough point at which even a fit, healthy person, resting in the shade, would theoretically be unable to survive prolonged exposure because their body would be physically incapable of shedding heat at all. But more recent research out of Penn State actually moved that number down, finding that severe, uncompensable heat stress can set in at a wet bulb temperature as low as 31 degrees, even in young, healthy adults doing nothing more strenuous than normal daily activity. 31, not 35, which is a meaningfully lower bar, and it means a lot more of the planet, a lot more of the time, sits closer to dangerous territory than the older estimates suggested. For older populations, the people most affected by everything we've talked about tonight, that safe threshold is likely lower still. There's a sentence I came across while reading into this that stuck with me. The idea that heat is often called the silent killer, and that in a lot of countries it's underreported as a cause of death compared to things like floods or storms, because there's no dramatic single moment, no wreckage, just a slow accumulation of strain on a body that quietly gives out. Globally, heat is estimated to cause somewhere around 500,000 deaths a year, and unlike a hurricane or an earthquake, most of those deaths happen indoors, alone, in homes that were never designed to cope with the temperatures now showing up outside their windows, which, funnily enough, brings us neatly to the next bit, because that phrase, homes that weren't designed to cope, is doing an enormous amount of work in this story, and I want to actually unpack why that's true across most of Europe. Here's a fact that genuinely surprised me when I first read it, and I think it'll surprise a fair few of you too. Roughly 1 in 5 homes in Europe has air conditioning. In the United States, it's about 9 in 10. That is an enormous gap. And it's not really about wealth. Plenty of European countries are perfectly rich enough to install it everywhere if they wanted to. It's almost entirely about history and architecture, and a kind of accumulated cultural assumption that simply hasn't caught up with the climate it now has to deal with. For a long time, large parts of southern Europe genuinely didn't need mechanical cooling, because the buildings themselves did the job. Thick stone or plaster walls, small windows, shutters that get closed during the hottest part of the day and opened again at night, whitewashed exteriors to reflect sunlight rather than absorb it. That's centuries of accumulated clever architectural knowledge, built up long before anyone had electricity, let alone a compressor and a refrigerant gas. And for most of those centuries, it worked perfectly well. Northern Europe has the opposite problem in a way, and it's arguably worse, because those homes were built to solve an entirely different problem, keeping heat in during long, cold, grey winters. Good insulation, double glazing, design choices that trap warmth rather than release it, which is brilliant in January and increasingly miserable in late June, when the exact same insulation that keeps a house cosy in winter turns it into something closer to a greenhouse during a heat wave. A house built to retain heat doesn't really know the difference between retaining warmth you want and retaining warmth you very much don't. There's also a layer of genuine, sincere environmental hesitation sitting underneath all this, and I think it's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. Air conditioning isn't free, environmentally speaking. It's estimated to account for around 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which is roughly double what the entire aviation industry produces. So there's a real, uncomfortable tension at the heart of all this. The exact technology that would save the most lives right now is also a technology that, if adopted everywhere, all at once, with old-fashioned, inefficient units running on fossil fuel-powered grids, would make the underlying problem worse over the long run. It's not a simple villain and hero story. It's a difficult trade-off, and I don't think there's anything wrong with sitting with that discomfort for a moment rather than rushing past it. That said, attitudes are clearly shifting, and fast. Italy is maybe the clearest example. Back in 2003, during the heat wave we're going to talk about properly in a bit, somewhere between 10 and 15% of Italian households had air conditioning. By last year, that figure had climbed to over half. Italy now accounts for roughly a third of all the electricity used on air conditioning across the entire European Union, a single country carrying a third of the continent's cooling load. That's not a gradual cultural drift. That's a near total reversal of how an entire nation thinks about hot weather, compressed into about 20 years. Britain's seen something similar, just starting from a much lower base and a few years behind. The number of homes with some form of air conditioning has roughly doubled in the space of about 3 years, and during this particular heat wave, shops in France were reportedly selling out of portable units entirely. There was a story going round about an 81-year-old woman in a Paris suburb who went round several shops with a friend looking for a unit, and came back empty-handed every time, ending up saying that during the day it was actually more bearable sitting in her car than staying in her own flat, which she described as feeling surreal. I think that one detail, an elderly woman finding her car a cooler refuge than her own home, says more about this whole topic than almost any statistic could. And the thing is, the evidence for air conditioning actually saving lives is strong, not just anecdotal. Research has found it can cut heat-related deaths by something like 75%, and a study published in The Lancet estimated that, globally, in a single recent year, nearly 200,000 heat deaths among people over 65 were averted, purely because air conditioning was available to them. That's not a marginal benefit. That's the difference between life and death for an enormous number of vulnerable people. There is one odd wrinkle worth mentioning, though, because it's the kind of thing that makes a topic feel properly three-dimensional rather than flat. air conditioning doesn't just move heat from inside a building to nowhere, it moves it outside, into the street. Research looking at Paris specifically found that widespread air conditioning use could push outdoor temperatures up by 2 to 4 degrees in dense parts of the city, which is a real problem in a continent full of tightly packed historic centres with narrow streets and not much green space to soak that extra heat back up. Spain, interestingly, has actually legislated around this a little, requiring air conditioning in public spaces to be set no cooler than 27 degrees, partly to save energy, and partly, I'd guess, to avoid exactly this kind of cascading effect. Looking forward, the trajectory seems pretty clear regardless of how anyone feels about it. Industry projections suggest the number of air conditioning units installed across the EU could more than double by 2050, which feels, on balance, like an entirely predictable outcome for a continent that keeps having summers like this one, whatever the environmental cost of getting there turns out to be. Right. I think it's time to go properly back in time because none of this, the alert systems, the nursing home rules, the phone check-ins for elderly neighbours, none of it exists by accident. It all traces back to one specific, genuinely harrowing summer just over 20 years ago that I think deserves its own proper space tonight. Okay, this is a big one, so let's take our time with it. In August 2003, Europe was hit by a heatwave that, even with everything we've talked about tonight, still stands as the deadliest weather event the continent has experienced in modern times. The final, fully reconciled estimate puts the death toll at over 70,000 people across Europe that summer. In France alone, just in the first 20 days of August, there were roughly 15,000 more deaths than would normally be expected for that period. 15,000 in 20 days in one country. What makes 2003 such an important story to actually understand rather than just a grim number to file away is why the death toll got that high, because the why reveals an enormous amount about how heat actually kills people, and it's not really about the heat itself, not directly. It's about isolation. France's housing, as we touched on a moment ago, is mostly stone, concrete and brick. The kind of construction that barely warms up during the day and barely needs air conditioning, because under normal conditions the nights cool things back down reliably. That's been true for generations. It's baked into how people live, how buildings are designed, what's considered normal. But in August 2003, the nights simply stopped cooling. Temperatures stayed at record highs around the clock day after day, which broke the entire rhythm that French housing and French expectations about housing had quietly relied on for decades. Elderly people living alone had never faced anything like it before, and a lot of them didn't recognise the danger until it was far too late to act. Here's the detail that I think is the most quietly devastating part of the whole story, and it runs almost completely against what you'd intuitively expect. The elderly people who needed the most medical care, the most frail, the ones in nursing homes or under regular supervision, actually survived at noticeably higher rates than independently living seniors who were, on paper, far healthier, because the frail ones had someone checking on them constantly, as a matter of routine. The independently living, comparatively fit elderly people were the ones who slipped through, because nobody was checking, because they seemed fine, because nobody had any reason to think they wouldn't be. A French Red Cross official, reflecting on it afterwards, said something that stayed with me, that France's family structures are more dislocated than elsewhere in Europe, and that once older people end up behind their own front door alone, the prevailing attitude was that they'd become somebody else's problem, almost by default. He put it plainly, saying these thousands of elderly victims didn't really die from a heat wave as such. They died from isolation and a lack of support that any crisis at all could have turned fatal. The heat was really just the trigger. The actual cause sat underneath it, quietly, the whole time. The statistics back that read up starkly. Around 82% of the people who died that summer were 75 or older. And of the people in Paris who died at home specifically, 92% of them were estimated to have been living alone. 92%. Almost every single one. What I find hard to sit with is how unprepared everyone was for it, at every level. At the time, the heat was being treated, publicly, almost as a bit of a novelty, good weather for the summer, something to enjoy. The newspapers ran pictures of people enjoying the sunshine. The health minister gave a reassuring address on television from his own holiday home, and then, over the course of about 2 weeks, the country quietly slid into a genuine humanitarian emergency that almost nobody in a position of authority had seen coming or taken seriously enough until it was already well underway. Morgues across the country were completely overwhelmed. In Paris specifically, authorities had to commandeer a refrigerated storage facility, normally used to keep food cold at a wholesale market, just to have somewhere to put the bodies, because the actual morgues and funeral homes had run entirely out of capacity. And there's a detail from that period that I think captures the horror of it better than any number could. When people returned home from their own summer holidays at the end of August, some of them found stains on their ceilings, left by the bodily fluids of elderly neighbours upstairs who had died alone, in the heat, days or weeks earlier, and simply hadn't been found yet because nobody had been checking. It genuinely shocked the country, in a way that I think permanently changed how France thinks about extreme weather. One person who's worked on heat policy ever since described 2003 almost like a message arriving from the future, a warning saying essentially you need to get ready because I'm going to come back. And to its credit, France actually did get ready. The following year, the government built a proper national heatwave plan from scratch, with a structured forecasting and alert system that's still in use today, colour-coded from green up to red, with specific mandatory actions attached to each level. Nursing homes were required by law to have at least one room with functioning air conditioning, a rule that's still in place. Local councils started running phone check-in programs specifically targeting elderly and vulnerable residents during hot spells so that someone, somewhere, was actually keeping track of who might be struggling alone. Building regulations were updated too, with rules from 2012 onwards requiring new construction to account for heat comfort, not just winter insulation, which is precisely the gap we talked about a moment ago. And cities, Paris especially, leaned hard into urban greening, more trees, more parks, more shaded public space, partly as a direct response to the urban heat island effect we discussed earlier. The plan has clearly worked in the sense that mortality during subsequent heat waves, even severe ones, has been measurably lower than it would otherwise have been. But I think it's worth being honest that it hasn't solved the problem, it's managed it. Someone who's spent years analysing the policy's effectiveness put it to me in a way I found genuinely thought-provoking, saying that the piece still missing even now might be a fuller understanding of just how severe future events are likely to be if climate change isn't properly addressed at the source, because there's a comfortable, very human assumption that we'll simply find a way to adapt and keep adapting indefinitely. And there's a limit to that. Adaptation buys time. It doesn't make the underlying trend go away. It's also worth a quick word on the rest of the continent that summer because France wasn't alone in this, just the most studied case. Portugal lost an estimated 1,900 people and also faced devastating wildfires that destroyed something like 5% of its entire countryside, fueled by hot, dry winds. The Netherlands recorded around 1,500 heat-related deaths, again concentrated heavily among the elderly. And Spain's official initial count, remarkably, was just 141 deaths, a number that was later revised after proper statistical research to nearly 13,000. Which tells you something rather important on its own, that even identifying a heatwave death toll accurately is difficult, and that early official figures in the moment are very often a significant undercount of what actually happened. So that's 2003. The summer that, more than any other single event, taught Europe that heat could kill at this scale and forced a continent that had never really had to think about extreme heat to start building the systems we still rely on today. It's not ancient history, by the way. It's barely more than 2 decades old. Some of the people reading this probably remember it. And it absolutely wasn't the last one. So 2003 wasn't a one-off tragedy that got fixed and filed away. It was really the first entry in a pattern that's kept repeating, with the gaps between entries getting steadily shorter. 2019 brought another severe spell. Parts of France hit numbers that, at the time, were considered almost unthinkable, and the national heatwave plan we just talked about was credited with keeping the death toll considerably lower than 2003's, even though the temperatures themselves were in places comparable or worse, which is a good news story in its own narrow way, proof that preparation actually works. But the summer that I think deserves real attention here is 2022, because it turned out to be the hottest season on record across Europe at the time, and researchers who went back afterwards and properly crunched the mortality data, using records covering well over 500 million people across 35 countries, arrived at a sobering estimate. somewhere in the region of 61,700 heat-related deaths across the continent between late May and early September that year. Italy carried the heaviest individual burden with an estimated 18,000 deaths, followed by Spain at a bit over 11,000, then Germany at just over 8,000. But raw totals like that can be a bit misleading on their own, because they're partly just a function of population size. Bigger countries naturally rack up bigger numbers. The more telling figures, I think, are the rates, deaths per million people, because that strips population size out of the equation entirely. By that measure, it was Italy again at the top, followed closely by Greece, then Spain, then Portugal. Which lines up almost exactly with the geography we talked about earlier, the countries sitting closest to that natural heat corridor running up from North Africa. There's a detail buried in that research that genuinely surprised me, and I don't think it gets talked about nearly enough. Relative to population, the researchers found around 56% more heat deaths among women than men overall. But it wasn't a uniform pattern across every age group. It actually flipped depending on age. Among younger and middle-aged adults, up to about 64, men died at meaningfully higher rates than women, plausibly tied to things like outdoor manual work. But among the very oldest group, 80 plus, it reversed, with women dying at notably higher rates than men. Which makes a certain grim sense when you think about it, because women, on average, live longer than men, so there are simply more very elderly women living alone in the first place, which loops straight back to that isolation pattern from 2003 that we already covered properly. A separate piece of global research, looking specifically at 2023, estimated something like 178,000 excess deaths worldwide linked to heatwaves that year, and, genuinely strikingly, calculated that just over half of those deaths globally were directly attributable to human-caused climate change, not just heat in some general, abstract sense, but heat that specifically wouldn't have reached deadly levels without the warming we've caused. Within that global total, Southern Europe came out with one of the highest regional mortality rates anywhere on the planet, ahead of most of Asia, ahead of most of the Americas. And there's a broader figure worth sitting with for a second before we move on, which is that the World Health Organization has put the total number of heat-related deaths across Europe just over the past 4 years at somewhere around 200,000 people. 200,000. Which means this year's event, as devastating as it already is, sits within an established and steadily worsening pattern, rather than appearing out of nowhere as some sort of freak anomaly. I think the honest, slightly uncomfortable takeaway from walking through 2019, 2022 and 2023 like this is that the gap between unprecedented events has been shrinking year on year. 2003 was treated understandably as a once-in-a-century catastrophe, a genuine outlier. By 2022, a summer that broke records just as badly was being described, almost matter-of-factly, as simply the hottest on record so far, with the unspoken implication that the record would, inevitably, be broken again before too long, which it now has been. Twice, this year alone, if you count both heatwaves separately. Which brings us, I think fairly naturally, to the question that's been sitting quietly underneath every single thing we've talked about so far tonight. Is this actually climate change, properly scientifically speaking, or is it just a run of unlucky weather years? I want to give that question the proper, careful space it deserves, rather than just asserting an answer and moving on. Right, so how do scientists actually answer a question like that? Properly, rather than just gesturing vaguely at warming temperatures and hoping everyone nods along. There's a whole specific field for it, called attribution science, and the method behind it is honestly more rigorous than I expected when I first looked into it. The basic approach works like this. Researchers take a real, observed event, this year's heatwave say, and they run it through climate models twice. Once using the actual climate we currently have, with all the warming that's happened since industrialization, and once using a simulated version of the climate as it would have looked without human-caused emissions, essentially a parallel world where we never burned all that fossil fuel. Then they compare how likely an event of that exact severity would be in each version. It's a clever bit of scientific accounting, and it lets researchers put an actual number on something that used to be pure speculation. A rapid analysis from the team at World Weather Attribution, who specialise in exactly this kind of rapid turnaround research, looked at this year's June heatwave and concluded it was the most severe event of its kind ever recorded across the region they studied, and their headline finding was stark. They calculated that comparable June heat would have been virtually impossible back in 1976 in a world without human-caused warming. Not unlikely. Virtually impossible. A scientist from the World Meteorological Organization framed the broader trend in a way I found useful, pointing out that heat waves like the ones we're seeing now are roughly 30 times more likely to happen today than they were in the era before climate change took hold. 30 times. And there's a related way of putting the same idea that I think lands even harder. The observation that an exceptional heat wave like this one would, in the climate of a few decades ago, have been roughly a once-in-300-year event. Now, events of that severity are happening more often than once a decade. That's not a subtle shift in probability. That's an entire category of weather moving from the edge of the statistically conceivable to something that's now essentially routine. And it's not happening evenly across the globe either, which is a detail that genuinely surprised me when I first came across it. Europe is warming faster than almost anywhere else on Earth, roughly twice the global average rate, according to the World Meteorological Organization. One of their climate scientists pointed out that in the 50 years since the historic heatwave of 1976, which used to be the reference point for the bad one, the one everyone compared subsequent heatwaves against, Europe as a whole has warmed by around 2 full degrees. 2 degrees doesn't sound like a huge number on paper, but spread across an entire continent's baseline climate, over 50 years, it's the difference between heatwaves being a rare, talked about anomaly, and heatwaves becoming, essentially, an expected feature of most summers. There's a phrase that started showing up in how officials talk about this. The idea that what used to be called a once-in-a-generation heatwave is now occurring nearly every single year, which is, if you actually sit with it for a second, a strange thing for language to do, because once in a generation was supposed to mean exactly that. An event so rare it happens roughly once across an entire human lifetime. If it's happening annually now, the phrase has effectively stopped meaning anything at all. It's just become a habit of speech that the underlying reality has already outgrown. I'll be honest, there's one quote from this year specifically that I genuinely enjoyed, in a slightly dark way. The UN's climate chief described the intensity of this particular June heatwave as having, in his words, the fingerprints of the climate crisis all over it. And he said that while speaking at a climate conference in London, that had itself just been forced to cancel one of its own outdoor sessions because of the extreme heat. There's something almost poetically blunt about a climate change conference getting physically rained out, or rather baked out by the exact thing it exists to discuss. You couldn't write a better bit of dramatic irony if you tried, and nobody had to. I think it's worth being careful, though, not to present any of this as some sort of distant, abstract, far-off future threat, because that's clearly not what it is anymore. The United Nations Secretary-General, speaking around the same period, pointed out that humanity has just lived through the 11 hottest years ever recorded, back to back, and warned that the broader patterns driving all this, things like El Niño cycles layering on top of an already warming baseline, aren't a distant possibility on the horizon. They're already here, already reshaping food systems, water supplies, and, as we've spent most of tonight discussing, who lives and who doesn't during a heatwave. So, to actually answer the question properly, no, this isn't simply an unlucky run of weather years. The science, as far as attribution research currently stands, is about as clear as this kind of complex statistical analysis ever gets. The heat is real, the trend is measurable, and the mechanism connecting it to human activity is about as well understood as anything in modern climate science. But I don't want to end on quite that heavier note, because there's a whole other side to tonight's story that's fascinating in a much lighter way, all the strange, specific, granular ways this particular heatwave has rippled out into ordinary daily life across the continent. Trains, drawbridges, a tennis match, an algal bloom of all things. This is the bit I actually had the most fun researching, if I'm honest, because once you stop looking at the headline numbers and start looking at the small, weird, specific consequences, the whole event starts to feel a lot more textured and a lot more real. Let's start in France, where the disruption to ordinary life was genuinely widespread. Music festivals got cancelled outright. Street parties, including Paris Pride, were called off entirely, which is a fairly significant thing to lose for a city that size. Authorities in Paris went as far as limiting the sale and public consumption of alcohol during the worst of it, presumably on the fairly sound logic that getting drunk in 40-degree heat is a bad combination for anyone's kidneys. The Netherlands had maybe my favourite small, strange detail of the whole event. In the southeast of the country, public transport had to be partially suspended, not because of the heat directly affecting passengers, but because the electric buses simply could not be charged properly in those temperatures. There's something quietly funny and quietly alarming about an entire transport network getting taken down by a battery management problem. A thoroughly 21st century failure mode that nobody designing those bus networks 20 years ago would have ever thought to plan around. And the Dutch heat story doesn't stop there. For the first time in the country's history, its National Weather Service issued a red alert specifically because of heat, the highest level on their warning scale, a threshold that had simply never been crossed before for this particular hazard. Their definition of a heat wave is actually fairly precise, 5 consecutive days above 25 degrees, with at least 3 of those days reaching above 30. When that threshold gets hit, the National Public Health Institute formally activates a heatwave plan. The national rail operator deliberately runs fewer trains as a precaution, and, in a detail I genuinely did not see coming, authorities have to spray water onto the metal mechanisms of the country's famous drawbridges just to stop them physically jamming in the heat, because metal expands when it's hot, and a jammed drawbridge over a canal is apparently a real and recurring problem during severe heat waves. During the worst days, plenty of drawbridges simply stopped working altogether, stranding boat traffic on the canals for hours at a time. Power infrastructure took a hit too, in places you might not expect. In Brittany, in the usually mild, temperate northwest corner of France, a heat-related equipment failure cut power to tens of thousands of households, right at the exact moment those households most needed their electric fans to actually function. There's a particular kind of dark irony in losing the ability to cool down precisely because of the heat that made cooling down necessary in the first place. Further east, as the heat dome rolled into Poland, the concern shifted toward wildfire risk, made considerably worse by a notably dry spring. Towns set up public water curtains, essentially misting stations people could walk through to cool off, and the National Rail Company started warning that the heat itself was physically deforming train tracks and causing power lines to sag, offering full refunds on weekend travel rather than risk running services over infrastructure that wasn't behaving the way it normally would. Germany and the Czech Republic both issued red alerts specifically for extreme fire danger, as the dome settled in over them too, with low humidity and erratic winds creating exactly the conditions wildfires need to spread fast and unpredictably. Satellite data added a properly striking visual to all this. Imaging from the European Space Agency's Copernicus program, taken during the peak of the French and Spanish heat, showed ground surface temperatures, which run hotter than standard air temperature readings, exceeding 50 degrees across large stretches of those two countries. Worth being precise about that distinction, by the way. Surface temperature and air temperature aren't quite the same measurement, but the scale of it is still an arresting thing to see laid out as a satellite image. Vast red and purple patches stretching across the map. There were stranger, more isolated incidents too, scattered through the wider weather chaos that tends to accompany events like this. A tennis match in Berlin got suspended for 6 hours after severe thunderstorms rolled through. The kind of violent, fast-moving storm that often forms at the unstable edges of a heat dome, where extremely hot air collides with cooler air trying to push in. In the Netherlands, a single overnight thunderstorm produced something close to 190,000 individual lightning strikes, breaking the country's daily record and causing damage severe enough in one eastern region that investigators suspected an actual tornado had touched down briefly amid the chaos. And, in one of those small details that just makes a topic feel more alive, a fresh algal bloom appeared across parts of the Baltic Sea during the same window, driven by the same unusually warm, sunny conditions that were cooking everything on land. There's a sobering geopolitical layer sitting underneath some of this too, worth a brief mention. Ukraine, still dealing with a power grid badly damaged by ongoing conflict, was reportedly bracing for the heat dome's eastward arrival, fully aware that a grid already under strain copes far worse, with a sudden surge in demand from millions of people, switching on whatever cooling they can get their hands on, all at once. I think what I take from this whole stretch of smaller stories is how interconnected modern infrastructure actually is, in ways that mostly stay completely invisible until something like this comes along and tests every single weak point simultaneously. Trains, drawbridges, batteries, power grids, tennis matches, the things we generally don't think about at all, turn out to be quietly, intricately dependent on a fairly narrow band of weather conditions staying roughly normal. When that band gets blown wide open, even briefly, you find out exactly how much of daily life was built on an assumption of moderate weather that isn't holding up the way it used to. I want to bring it back to people for a bit and talk properly about who actually bears the brunt of all this. Because there's a genuinely interesting wrinkle in the research that complicates the simple story you might expect. We've already covered the core of this, really, back when we talked about 2003 and that pattern of isolated elderly people bearing the worst of it, so I don't want to go over that ground again. But there's a layer to this question that I think adds some useful nuance, rather than just repeating the elderly are vulnerable for the 5th time tonight, which, true as it is, doesn't tell the whole story on its own. There's a piece of research out of Mexico, using wet bulb temperature data specifically, that found something I genuinely didn't expect going in. While older people remain the largest group affected by heat overall, younger people are disproportionately affected too, in a way that doesn't fit the usual mental image most of us carry around of who a heatwave actually endangers. It's a useful reminder that vulnerability to heat isn't purely a function of age in any simple linear way. It's tangled up with things like outdoor labour, housing quality, access to shade and water during the day, and plenty of other factors that don't always sort neatly along generational lines the way you'd assume. There's a separate study, this one looking at ambulance dispatch data during heatwave conditions, that found something similarly nuanced. Emergency call-outs for heat-related illness, breathing problems, sudden unconsciousness and trauma all rose significantly during hot spells, and women were dispatched to at a notably higher rate than men overall. But broken down by age, the sharpest increases showed up at both ends of the spectrum simultaneously. Children and teenagers on one side, people in their late 70s and early 80s on the other, with working-age adults sitting somewhere in the comparatively safer middle. Which makes a certain intuitive sense once you think about it properly, because both ends of that range share something important in common. Neither group's body regulates temperature with quite the same efficiency as a healthy adult in their 30s or 40s does. There's one more finding from that same piece of research that I think is worth flagging, because it has an obvious, immediate relevance to exactly what's happening across Europe this year. The very first heatwave of any given season tends to be measurably more dangerous than the ones that follow it, even when later heatwaves hit similar or higher peak temperatures. The thinking is that the human body can partially acclimatise to heat over time, given a bit of repeated exposure, sweating slightly more efficiently, adjusting blood flow patterns a touch, that sort of thing. But that adjustment takes time to kick in, and it resets somewhat over the cooler months, so the very first proper hot spell of a new year tends to catch people's bodies off guard, in a way later heat doesn't quite manage to, which is a slightly uncomfortable detail to sit with, given everything we've covered tonight, because remember, this year had 2 separate heat waves, late May and then mid to late June. If that acclimatization pattern holds true, the second, far more severe wave should, in theory, have hit a population that was at least somewhat more heat adapted than they'd have been completely cold, so to speak, which makes the scale of this year's death toll, arriving on top of whatever partial adaptation people's bodies had already built up, feel like an even starker signal of just how extreme the second wave was. There's also a city-specific angle worth a quick mention, tying back neatly to that urban heat island effect from earlier, without re-explaining the whole mechanism again. Researchers studying industrial areas around Athens using satellite imagery found that during a recent severe heat wave there, surface temperatures in the most built-up, least green parts of the city briefly exceeded 50 degrees in individual hotspots, driven almost entirely by the sheer density of concrete and the near-total absence of vegetation. So if you're picturing who's most at risk during an event like this, it's worth adding one more silhouette to the picture alongside the isolated elderly person and the outdoor labourer. Someone living in a dense, low-income, heavily paved part of a city, in a flat with no garden, no balcony, and no real shade for streets in any direction. So pulling all of that together, age matters enormously, but it's not the whole story. Isolation matters, as we covered properly with 2003. Housing and neighbourhood density matter. Timing within the season matters, in a way I genuinely hadn't considered before looking into this. It's less a single clean risk factor and more a kind of accumulating set of disadvantages, where the people who end up worst affected tend to be the ones sitting at the unlucky intersection of several of these factors at once, rather than any single one in isolation. All right, let's end the more serious run of sections on a slightly more hopeful note, because there genuinely is one, and I think it deserves proper airtime rather than getting squeezed in as an afterthought. What's actually being done about all this, right now, across the continent? France's national heatwave plan, the one born directly out of that catastrophic summer back in 2003, has actually kept evolving in the years since, rather than just sitting frozen as a single fixed policy from 2 decades ago. The colour-coded alert system, green moving up through yellow, orange, and finally red, still forms the backbone of it, with each level triggering specific predetermined actions rather than vague advice. The National Weather Service, the Public Health Agency, and the Health Ministry all coordinate daily during an active alert, comparing notes and adjusting the response in something close to real time as conditions shift. In 2023, the country went a step further, unveiling its first proper heatwave management plan that sits alongside the original health-focused one, this time bringing the Environment Ministry into the picture as a genuine equal partner rather than a secondary consideration, which feels like a meaningful shift in framing, treating extreme heat as something to be actively adapted around through infrastructure and planning, not purely a medical emergency to be managed once it's already arrived on the doorstep. Urban greening has become a particularly visible part of that adaptation, especially in Paris, where parks, street trees and small pockets of green space have been steadily added across the city over the past several years, specifically targeting that urban heat island effect we talked about earlier. There's a sound bit of science behind why this actually works too, beyond just looking nice. Watered green space cools the air around it through evaporation, in much the same basic principle as sweat cooling human skin, so a well-maintained, properly irrigated park does measurably more cooling work for its surrounding streets than a dry, unwatered patch of grass ever could. One researcher, who's spent years analysing how well all of this is actually working, offered a reflection that I think is worth ending this part of tonight on, because it strikes a careful, honest balance rather than leaning too far toward either blind optimism or outright despair. She said the piece that might still be missing even now is a fuller public understanding of just how serious the events ahead could become if the underlying drivers of climate change aren't properly addressed, rather than simply managed around at the edges. There's a comfortable, very human tendency, she suggested, to assume that things will get harder, sure, but that we'll always find some way to adapt and keep adapting, more or less indefinitely. And her honest, considered view is that there's a limit to how far that adaptation can actually stretch. I don't think that's a bleak note, particularly despite how it might read on the page. I think it's a useful, clear-eyed one. The plans that exist, the alert systems, the nursing home regulations, the phone check-ins, the building codes, they're all real, they all measurably work, and they've already saved a meaningful number of lives in every heatwave since 2003 that's been studied properly. But they're best understood as buying time and reducing harm at the margins, not as a permanent, complete solution to a problem that keeps getting structurally bigger underneath them, year after year. Beyond any single country's individual policies, there's coordinated effort happening at the continental and global level too. The World Meteorological Organization works alongside national weather services across Europe to share early warnings and coordinate heat health action plans across borders on the fairly sound logic that a heat dome doesn't respect national boundaries, so an effective response probably shouldn't be confined neatly within them either. During the absolute peak of this particular event, forecasters estimated that somewhere around 191 million people across the continent were facing temperatures of at least 35 degrees on a single given day. 191 million. For a sense of scale, that's something like a quarter of Europe's entire population, all sweltering under broadly the same band of extreme heat on the very same afternoon. So that's where things stand. Imperfect, evolving, clearly still playing catch-up with a climate that keeps moving the goalposts faster than policy can comfortably keep pace with, but not standing still either. There's real, measurable, institutional learning happening here, slowly accumulating with each event, the kind that doesn't make for a dramatic headline on its own, but does, when you trace it carefully across 2 decades like we've done tonight, add up to something that genuinely matters and genuinely saves lives. Right. I want to step away from policy for a stretch and talk about what all this heat is actually doing to the land itself, the soil, the crops, the rivers, because that side of the story doesn't get nearly as much attention as it deserves. I want to step away from human bodies and infrastructure for a bit and talk about what all this heat is doing to the actual land underneath everyone's feet, because it's a strand of the story that doesn't get nearly as much airtime as the death tolls and the broken thermometer records, even though it's quietly enormous in its own right. Heat and drought tend to arrive as a package deal, reinforcing each other in a way that's almost a bit unfair, mechanically speaking. Dry soil heats up faster than wet soil, because there's no moisture left to absorb energy through evaporation. So a drought makes the air above it hotter, and that extra heat then dries the soil out even further. It's a proper feedback loop, each half of the pair making the other one worse. Going into this year's heat waves, large parts of France and Central and Eastern Europe were already sitting in drought conditions, monitored by an official European observatory that tracks soil moisture continuously across the continent. And as the second heatwave intensified through June, that drought picture only deepened across countries including the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Poland, Hungary and Romania. That combination, baking heat on top of already parched ground, is exactly the recipe wildfires need. We touched briefly earlier on the red alerts for fire risk that swept through Germany and the Czech Republic as the heat dome shifted east, and on Poland's concerns about its forests given how dry the preceding spring had been, so I won't repeat all that again here. What I do want to add is a bit of texture around just how much economic damage this kind of compound event tends to cause, because it's genuinely staggering once you see it laid out properly. A couple of summers ago, Sicily offered a vivid case study in what severe drought does to an agricultural economy. Reservoir levels across the island dropped well below alert thresholds, down something like 45% compared with the year before, forcing local authorities to bring in water-saving restrictions just to keep the taps running. Citrus orchards, wheat fields and vineyards all took a direct hit, with the economic damage from that single regional drought estimated at somewhere around €2.5 billion. One island, one bad dry season, that level of cost. And Sicily is far from alone in being exposed this way. Looking across the European Union as a whole, drought now accounts for over half of all agricultural losses linked to extreme weather, comfortably ahead of heavy rain, frost and hail combined. Vineyards specifically are a nice, slightly melancholy lens to look at this through, because wine production is about as deeply tied to a very narrow, very specific band of climate as any agricultural product gets. Grapes that have been grown in more or less the same way, in more or less the same regions for centuries, are increasingly ripening earlier, with higher sugar content and lower acidity than growers are used to working with, which changes the character of the wine itself, not just the yield. It's one of those changes that's almost invisible if you're not looking for it. A glass of wine doesn't come with a thermometer reading attached, but it's a real, measurable shift happening across some of Europe's oldest and most established growing regions. Zooming out to the continental level, the broader figures get sobering. Across one recent year alone, floods, droughts, heatwaves and wildfires combined caused more than €45 billion in damage across 38 European countries, according to the EU's own Environment Agency. And the long-term agricultural projections aren't exactly comforting either. Researchers modelling future yields under continued warming have estimated that maize and wheat harvests in southern Europe could fall by close to half by the middle of this century if current warming trends continue more or less unchecked. I think the thing that makes this part of the story land differently from the death toll numbers, at least for me, is the timescale. A heatwave passes, the temperature drops, the red alerts get lifted, the news cycle moves on within a week or two. But a drought year, a ruined harvest, a vineyard that's permanently shifted its character, those effects linger for a season, sometimes for years, quietly reshaping an entire region's economy and way of life, long after anyone's still talking about the actual hot fortnight that triggered it. There is, I'll say, a hopeful thread running through the policy side of all this too. The European Union is actively working on a more integrated framework for climate resilience, with a principle they call resilience by design, the idea that any new infrastructure investment, anything built from this point onward, needs to be engineered from the outset to withstand the climate risks it's likely to face over its entire working lifetime, rather than being built for yesterday's weather and hoping for the best. It's not glamorous policy work, Nobody's making a documentary about building codes anytime soon, but it's the kind of quiet, structural, unglamorous adaptation that actually compounds into something meaningful over a decade or two, in exactly the way the French heatwave plan we discussed earlier has. This next bit's a touch lighter, because I want to talk about a group that's been affected by all this just as much as we have, but who get mentioned a lot less often: the animals. This one's a bit gentler, I promise, even though the underlying subject is still heat stress, because I think there's something soothing about zooming out from human systems for a while and just thinking about the rest of the living world trying to cope with the same conditions we've spent most of tonight discussing. Pets are the most immediately relatable place to start because most of us have either got one or know someone who does. Dogs and cats can't sweat the way humans can. They rely almost entirely on panting, and a much smaller number of sweat glands concentrated in their paw pads, which is a far less efficient cooling system than what we've got. That means heat stroke in a dog can develop frighteningly fast, sometimes inside half an hour, and the advice from vets during events like this is fairly consistent wherever you look. Keep them in the coolest part of the house, shift walks to early morning or late evening, and never, under any circumstances, leave them in a parked car, which is now actually against the law in several European countries, not just generally inadvisable. Wild animals have it harder still in a way, because nobody's specifically looking out for them the way a pet owner looks out for a dog. Heat brings dehydration, exhaustion, and the slow disappearance of the food and water sources a lot of smaller creatures depend on day to day. There's some genuinely lovely, simple advice that animal charities put out during heatwaves like this one. Things like leaving a shallow dish of water out in a shaded spot in your garden, with a stone or small object inside it, so insects and tiny animals don't accidentally drown while trying to drink, and topping it up fresh each day. Leaving a patch of your garden unmown can help too, creating a slightly cooler, shadier refuge that a manicured lawn just doesn't offer. It's a small thing, small in the scheme of everything else we've covered tonight, but it's one of the few pieces of this whole story where an ordinary person can do something directly useful in about 30 seconds, which I find oddly comforting. Farm animals are where this tips from a welfare concern into a proper economic one, and the story coming out of Belgium during this exact heatwave was a good illustration of it. The country issued a rare red alert for extreme heat, and farmers started reporting that their cows and pigs were visibly struggling, eating less, moving around less, and even avoiding lying down on bedding that had got too warm, all of which adds up to noticeably reduced milk and meat output. One farmer interviewed about it said he was already using fans to help cool his animals, but that the heat was simply outpacing what those measures could manage, and that he expected to need to invest in proper artificial cooling systems for livestock housing going forward, something that's historically only been worth the cost for a handful of days a year, but is quickly becoming a much more regular necessity. There's a piece of longer-term research on this that I think is worth a brief mention, because it puts a number on a problem that's otherwise easy to wave away as a future, somebody else's problem. Researchers modelling cattle exposure across Europe found that somewhere between 11 and 22% of the continent's entire cattle population could be facing significantly more heatwave days within the next few decades, with cattle kept indoors, ironically, often worse affected than those out grazing, because indoor housing that was designed for a cooler, more temperate climate can trap heat just as effectively as the human houses we talked about earlier. The researchers were careful to point out that the fix isn't uniform either. What works for a dairy farm in the Alps looks nothing like what works for a sheep farm on the Mediterranean coast, which is, in miniature, basically the entire challenge of climate adaptation in a single sentence. And out in the wild spaces away from farms and gardens entirely, naturalists have noted forest animals instinctively seeking out shallow rivers, mud and wetlands during the worst of the heat, doing, in their own way, exactly what we do when we jump in a cold shower or wade into the sea. There's something quite grounding about that parallel, honestly. Whatever differences exist between a human nervous system and a deer's, the basic, ancient instinct to seek out water and shade when it's unbearably hot is shared right across the animal kingdom, ours included. I like ending on that thought, actually, the idea that this entire topic, for all its very modern trappings of satellite data and excess mortality statistics and electric buses that can't charge their batteries, is ultimately about an old, simple, universal problem. Living things getting too hot, and trying, in whatever way is available to them, to find somewhere cooler, right? I want to take one more proper detour before we head toward the end of tonight, because I think it's a useful one. How does the rest of the world, the parts that deal with extreme heat as a routine expected feature of life rather than a shocking, once-a-decade anomaly, actually manage all this? There's a lot Europe can, and probably will, end up learning from places that have been doing this far longer. I think it's easy, when you're sitting in the middle of a story like this one, to assume that Europe's experience of extreme heat is somehow the universal template. It isn't, not even close. Plenty of regions have been dealing with temperatures this severe or worse as a completely normal feature of life for generations, and looking at how they've adapted tells you a lot, both about what's possible and about how much harder this is for places without Europe's relative wealth to draw on. Take the Gulf states, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, and their neighbours. These are countries where summer temperatures routinely sit well above anything Europe experienced even during this year's worst days, and the entire built environment and a lot of daily scheduling has been shaped around that reality for decades. Outdoor working hours during peak summer heat are legally regulated across the region, with mandatory breaks during the hottest part of the afternoon. Several countries run dedicated public health campaigns specifically targeting heat stress and heat exhaustion, with names like Heat Action Day and Safe Summer, treating it with the same seriousness as a flu vaccination drive. The UAE became the first country in the region to formally commit to international agreements around sustainable cooling technology, recognizing fairly early that simply scaling up traditional air conditioning everywhere without addressing its own climate footprint just trades one problem for a slightly different one down the line. It's not a perfect system by any means. Researchers studying the region point out that a lot of the response is still fairly reactive rather than addressing root causes, but the sheer institutional seriousness with which heat gets treated, baked into law and daily routine rather than left to individual common sense, is a genuinely useful contrast to where most of Europe still sits. India offers a very different picture, and a considerably harder one, because the gap between what's needed and what's actually available is so much wider. Only a small fraction of Indian households, somewhere around 8%, have any access to air conditioning at all, and even where units exist, an unreliable power grid means they often can't be relied on during exactly the moments they're needed most, since electricity demand spikes hardest on the very hottest days, which is precisely when supply tends to falter. Roughly 3/4 of India's workforce is employed in heat, exposed outdoor work, agriculture and construction mostly, jobs that simply cannot be done from an air-conditioned office regardless of how high the temperature climbs. Researchers studying informal settlements in cities like Kolkata have found that indoor heat readings in slum housing regularly exceed 41 degrees for hours at a stretch during the hottest months, with economic constraints making it unlikely that conventional fixes like air conditioning will arrive at scale anytime soon. There's an interesting, slightly counterintuitive finding tucked into research on this too, that India's Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, a social welfare program that exists for entirely different reasons, ended up significantly cushioning some of heat's worst secondary effects, things like falling household income reducing children's school performance, simply by providing a more reliable financial safety net during disrupted harvest seasons. Sometimes the most effective heat adaptation policy isn't really about heat at all, it's about poverty, and the two turn out to be far more tangled together than you'd initially assume. There's a thread connecting both of these very different examples that I think is worth pulling out, which is that wealth, more than climate itself, ends up determining how survivable extreme heat actually is. The Gulf states can afford comprehensive top-down adaptation because they're extremely wealthy. India, despite having a vastly larger population exposed to comparable or worse heat, simply doesn't have the same resources to deploy at the same scale, and the human cost of that gap shows up clearly in the data every single year. There are some clever, low-cost adaptation techniques being championed globally too, ones that don't require anything like the GDP of a Gulf state to implement properly. Painting rooftops white to reflect sunlight rather than absorb it. Designing city streets and building layouts so they naturally funnel cooling breezes through dense urban areas instead of trapping heat. Planting shade trees deliberately along the routes people actually walk, not just in decorative parks tucked away from daily foot traffic. Improving home insulation specifically, so less mechanical cooling is needed in the first place, which circles back nicely to that exact gap in Northern European housing we talked about a while back, without needing to go over that ground again. Researchers estimate that scaling up this particular family of techniques globally could cut greenhouse gas emissions by well over 1 billion tonnes by 2050, broadly equivalent to taking somewhere close to 300 million cars off the road entirely. Which is a striking thing to realise, that some of the most effective tools we have for surviving a hotter world don't actually require any new technology whatsoever, just better, more deliberate use of paint, trees and street layout, things humans have frankly had access to for thousands of years. So where does that leave Europe, sitting in the middle of all this? Somewhere in between, really. Far wealthier than India, with genuinely more resources available to adapt properly if the political will is there, but considerably less institutionally prepared than the Gulf states, because Europe's housing stock, its cultural habits, its entire relationship with hot weather, was built around an assumption of moderate summers that, as we've spent most of tonight establishing, simply doesn't hold anymore. The good news, if there is a tidy bit of good news buried in all this, is that Europe doesn't have to invent its adaptation playbook from scratch. A fair amount of it already exists, tested and proven elsewhere, just waiting to be properly adopted at home. There's one more practical angle I want to cover before we get into anything heavier again, which is what one of these alerts actually changes for an ordinary person going about an ordinary week. I think we've talked a fair bit tonight about alerts and warning systems in the abstract, the colour-coded scales, the activation thresholds, that sort of thing, but I haven't really walked through what one of these alerts actually changes for an ordinary person going about an ordinary week. So let's do that, because I think it makes the whole system feel a lot more concrete. Italy's approach is a good place to start because it's fairly visible and fairly dramatic in how it scales. The Health Ministry maintains a running list of cities under its highest level alert, and during the peak of this year's event, that list grew almost daily, starting around a dozen major cities, including Rome, Florence, Bologna, Milan and Verona, and climbing higher within just a couple of days as the heat intensified further. Being on that list isn't just symbolic. It triggers specific guidance for hospitals to prepare for a surge in heat-related admissions, for local authorities to open designated cooling centres, often in libraries or community halls with reliable air conditioning, and for outdoor work, construction in particular, to be restricted or rescheduled around the hottest hours of the day. Schools are one of the more visible places this plays out too, across pretty much every country we've discussed tonight. Closures, shortened days, and modified timetables that push the school day earlier, finishing before the early afternoon peak, became fairly routine across large parts of the continent during the worst stretches of this heat wave. There's a particular vulnerability in school buildings that's worth flagging, because a lot of European school architecture, like a lot of European housing generally, simply wasn't designed with summer cooling in mind. Classrooms with large south-facing windows that were originally meant to maximise natural light, not minimise heat gain, can become unsafe environments for children to sit in for 6 hours during a severe heat wave. France's national alert system, the one descended directly from the 2003 reforms we discussed earlier, has fairly specific, almost bureaucratic-sounding triggers attached to each colour level, and I find there's something quietly reassuring about that specificity. Honestly, the idea that someone, somewhere, has already wargamed exactly what should happen at each stage, so nobody has to improvise a response from scratch in the middle of a crisis. Orange level puts departments on a kind of heightened readiness footing. Red, the top level, which during this year's June heatwave covered a record 58 departments at once, more or less the entire country, triggers the most intensive measures, including the kind of public event cancellations we mentioned earlier, the festivals, the street parties, alongside formal guidance urging vulnerable residents to check in with relatives or neighbours, and local authorities actively reaching out to people already registered on those vulnerability lists we discussed in the 2003 section. There's an interesting cultural dimension buried in all this too, because a lot of southern Europe has, for centuries, had an informal version of exactly this kind of heat scheduling built directly into daily life. The long midday closure, the siesta, shops and offices shutting for several hours during the hottest part of the afternoon, and reopening, refreshed, once the worst of it has passed. It's a tradition that's been gradually eroding for decades, partly under pressure from more globalised 9-to-5 working patterns imported from cooler climates, and partly because air conditioning made it feel, for a while, unnecessary. There's a small, slightly ironic possibility worth sitting with, that the very thing modernity nudged toward extinction might end up making a quiet comeback. Not as a cultural throwback exactly, but as a sensible, evidence-based response to a climate that's increasingly demanding exactly the kind of midday pause it was originally designed around. Construction sites across several countries adopted similarly practical adjustments during the worst of this event, shifting the working day to start considerably earlier, sometimes before 6 in the morning, specifically to get the most physically demanding outdoor labour done before the temperature climbs into genuinely dangerous territory by early afternoon. It's not a universal rule everywhere. Enforcement varies a fair bit from country to country, and even site to site, but the underlying logic that the most vulnerable hours of the day are entirely predictable and therefore entirely avoidable with a bit of scheduling discipline is sound. And it's exactly the same logic underpinning those Gulf state worker protection laws we discussed a moment ago, just arriving in Europe a few decades later under noticeably more pressing circumstances. I think what strikes me most, walking through all these small practical adjustments, is how much quiet, almost invisible adaptation is already happening underneath the big dramatic headline numbers. A shifted school timetable doesn't make the news the way a death toll does. A construction crew starting at 5:30 instead of 7 doesn't generate a single dramatic photograph. But multiplied across millions of small decisions like that, made by ordinary institutions just trying to keep people reasonably safe, it adds up to something that genuinely matters, even if it never gets its own headline. Here's an angle on this whole story that doesn't get nearly enough attention, given how big a deal it actually is economically. What does extreme heat do to a continent whose tourism industry has, for the better part of a century, been built almost entirely around the promise of a lovely, reliable summer? Southern Europe in particular has marketed itself on exactly this for generations: the warm Mediterranean coastline, the long sun-soaked afternoons, the kind of holiday weather Northern Europeans have traditionally travelled south specifically to find. It's an enormous industry, genuinely. Spain, France and Italy are consistently among the most visited countries on the entire planet, and a huge chunk of that visitor traffic arrives specifically in summer, chasing the sun, which creates a strange, almost paradoxical situation now. A tourism economy that's spent decades selling heat, increasingly having to manage the fact that the heat it's selling has become, on its worst days, actively dangerous to the very visitors it's trying to attract. You saw some fairly visible signs of this strain during the peak of this year's event. Famous landmarks adjusted their opening hours specifically because of the heat, with the Eiffel Tower closing entirely on one of the worst afternoons, and the Louvre restricting visiting hours as conditions became unsafe for the kind of queuing crowds those sites normally draw. There's something properly strange about picturing the Eiffel Tower, of all things, one of the most photographed, most reliably open tourist sites on the planet, just shutting its doors because of weather. But that's exactly what happened, more than once during this particular stretch of heat. Beach destinations face their own, slightly different version of the same tension. A scorching, record-breaking heat wave should, in theory, be brilliant news for a coastal resort town, more reason than ever to head to the water, and to some extent it is in the very short term. Beaches and coastal areas often see a genuine surge in visitors specifically trying to escape inland heat. But several towns also had to close stretches of their own beaches during the worst of this event, sometimes over entirely separate concerns like algal blooms or water quality issues that tend to flare up specifically during prolonged hot, still weather, which is a slightly cruel irony, the exact conditions driving people toward the coast for relief also being the conditions making parts of that coast less safe to actually swim in. There's a longer, slower economic story sitting underneath the dramatic headline closures too, one that plays out over years rather than single afternoons. Hotels and resorts across the Mediterranean have been gradually, quietly investing in things that would have seemed like unnecessary luxuries a couple of decades ago: comprehensive air conditioning throughout, not just in bedrooms but in lobbies and restaurants and pool areas, shaded outdoor seating designed from the ground up rather than added as an afterthought, and in some cases a genuine shift in marketing strategy itself, with destinations starting to promote spring and autumn travel, specifically as an alternative to peak summer, when conditions are more comfortable and considerably less risky for elderly visitors in particular. It's a slow, structural pivot, the kind that doesn't generate a single dramatic headline, but quietly reshapes an entire industry's calendar over the course of a decade. Labour productivity is the less glamorous, less photographed cousin of all this, but it's arguably the bigger economic story in the long run. Outdoor work of almost any kind, construction, agriculture, delivery driving, simply gets less efficient and considerably more dangerous once temperatures climb past a certain point, and the World Meteorological Organization has explicitly flagged labour productivity as one of the major impact categories of this year's event, alongside the more obvious headline categories of health and infrastructure. It's a difficult cost to put a precise number on in the moment, because it shows up gradually, as missed deadlines and reduced output and increased sick leave, rather than as one dramatic, easily reported figure. But economists who study this stuff are increasingly confident it adds up to a substantial drag on overall economic output, one that compounds, fairly predictably, with every additional heatwave a country experiences. I think the honest, slightly uncomfortable summary of this whole section is that Europe's relationship with its own summer is undergoing a genuine structural shift, not just a meteorological one. An entire economic identity built around reliable, pleasant heat is having to renegotiate itself in real time, working out which parts of that identity can survive a hotter, more dangerous climate, and which parts, the long lazy August afternoon spent entirely outdoors with no thought given to shade or hydration, might simply need to become something people did in the past tense, rather than something they can keep doing exactly the same way going forward. Before I let this go entirely though, I want to spend a minute on where things actually stand right now, because this isn't a tidy, finished story yet. It's still unfolding. Before I wind this all the way down, I think it's worth spending just a little time on where things actually stand as I'm putting this together, because this isn't a tidy closed story with a neat ending yet. It's still unfolding. As of the most recent forecasts I came across, the heat dome's core had settled in over Germany and was stretching out toward Poland and the Baltic states, with little sign of any major disturbance arriving to break the pattern before July properly begins. Forecasters were watching for a possible shift later on, a weaker, cooler push of Atlantic air eventually working its way in from the west, bringing some genuine relief to the countries that got hit earliest, even as the heat itself continued drifting further east and settling in over Central and Eastern Europe for a while longer. There was also talk, particularly out of the Netherlands, of a possible third heatwave forming behind this one, with some forecasters suggesting it could even challenge the records this second wave has only just finished setting. Which is a genuinely strange sentence to write, a country potentially facing a third record-threatening heat event inside a single summer, when a single such event used to be considered remarkable on its own. I don't want to overstate the certainty of any of that. By the way, weather forecasting beyond about a week or two starts getting fuzzy, even with all the modelling power available these days, and I'd rather be honest about that uncertainty than pretend to a confidence the science doesn't actually support. But the broader seasonal outlook for this year, independent of any single specific event, has consistently pointed toward an unusually warm, unusually dry summer across much of the continent, shaped by a combination of factors including a developing El Niño pattern in the Pacific and unusually warm sea surface temperatures sitting in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, both of which tend to load the dice toward exactly this kind of prolonged, stubborn heat. So if you're hoping I can tell you, confidently, that the worst is now behind us for this particular year, I genuinely can't promise that, and I don't think anyone honestly can, this far out. What I can say is that everything we've talked about tonight, the alert systems, the cooling centres, the phone check-ins for elderly neighbours, the shifted school and construction schedules, all of it is still actively running, still actively adjusting in real time as the heat moves across the map. The lessons from 2003 and from every heatwave since are still being applied, imperfectly but seriously, as this exact event continues to play out. I think that's actually a reasonable place to leave the factual, forward-looking part of tonight. Not a clean resolution, because there isn't one yet, just an honest snapshot of where things stand mid-story, with the people and institutions involved still actively working through it as best they can. I always end up with a little pile of details that don't quite fit anywhere else. By the time I get to the end of researching something like this, the odds and ends that struck me as interesting, but never found a proper home in any of the bigger sections. So, in no particular order, here are a few of them. I mentioned earlier that the UK issued what's called a red heat health alert during this event, and that's only the second time that specific top-tier warning has ever been used since the system was introduced. Not the second time this year, the second time ever, full stop. The first was only a couple of years prior. Two exceptional events, in a system that presumably wasn't expecting to use its higher setting more than once a generation when it was designed. There's a small, almost throwaway detail about the satellite monitoring side of all this that I quite liked. The European Space Agency's Sentinel satellites that produced those striking surface temperature maps weren't actually built specifically to track heat waves. Their primary mission is far broader, monitoring land and ocean conditions generally, things like vegetation health and sea surface temperature for entirely different scientific purposes. The heatwave mapping is, in a sense, a bonus use case, repurposing infrastructure that exists for other reasons because it happens to be extremely good at this particular job too. There's something quietly reassuring about that. The idea that a lot of the tools helping us understand and respond to this crisis weren't even built with it specifically in mind. They just turned out to be useful anyway. I also want to flag gently that drowning numbers came up more than once tonight, in more than one country, and it's worth restating just once, briefly, that this isn't really about carelessness. It's an entirely predictable, well-documented consequence of extreme heat that public health officials actively plan around now, which is exactly why you'll often see specific water safety messaging issued alongside heat alerts in several countries, not as an afterthought but as a core part of the response. And one final small thing, because I think it's a nice note to end the factual portion of tonight on. Despite absolutely everything we've covered, the death tolls, the broken infrastructure, the drought, the displaced wildlife, every single country we've discussed tonight has, at minimum, some version of a functioning early warning system now. That's not nothing. 20 years ago, several of these countries had no formal heatwave plan whatsoever. Now every one of them does, however imperfect, however much room there still is for improvement. That's genuine, hard-won institutional progress, built directly out of the kind of tragedy we spent a good chunk of tonight sitting with properly. It doesn't undo any of it. But it does mean that progress is real, and it's the kind of detail I think is worth holding on to, alongside everything heavier, as we head toward the end here. Given what this channel's actually for, I didn't want to wrap up without circling back to one thread we touched on earlier, because it feels like the right note to land on before I let you go. We talked, a good while back now, about tropical nights, the ones that never properly cool down, and about how dangerous that is medically, denying an already strained body its one real chance to recover before the next scorching day begins. I don't want to re-explain all that again, you've already got it. But I think it's worth sitting with for a second, away from the medical framing, just as a plain human experience, because almost everyone listening to this has had at least one truly miserable, sweaty, sheet-kicking night where sleep simply wouldn't come properly, and that specific kind of restlessness has been happening to millions of people across an entire continent, repeatedly, for weeks now. There's something quietly fitting, I think, about ending a story this hot with a thought about rest. The whole reason any of us are here, on a channel built around long rambling stories meant to ease you towards sleep, is that rest is precious, necessary, and apparently a lot more fragile, climatically speaking, than most of Europe ever really had to think about before. Wherever you're listening to this from, I hope your room's a reasonable temperature tonight, and I hope, heat dome or no heat dome, you actually get the proper, uninterrupted rest that an awful lot of people across Europe haven't been able to count on this particular summer, so that's where I'll leave it for tonight. We went a long way round from a town in southwest France, hitting numbers that belong in a different climate zone entirely, all the way back to a summer over 20 years ago that quietly rebuilt how an entire continent thinks about hot weather, and then out again into drawbridges and dairy cows and a tennis match interrupted by a storm. That's roughly how my brain actually works through a topic like this, in widening circles rather than a straight line, and I hope it landed all right for you too, wherever you drifted off along the way. If there's one thing I'd want to leave you with, it's not really a statistic at all, even though we've covered a fair few of those tonight. It's that quiet detail from the very end there, that every country we talked about now has some version of a system in place to catch people before they slip through, however imperfectly that system still works in practice. That feels like the right note to end on, not because it makes anything that happened this year all right, it doesn't, but because it's true, and because genuine, patient, unglamorous progress deserves to be part of the story too, not just the parts that make for a dramatic headline. I've got a few more topics rattling around that I think would make good companions to this one, possibly something properly deep on the 2003 summer specifically, or maybe a wander through how other kinds of extreme weather get tracked and predicted these days. We'll see where the mood takes things. For now though, that's everything. Thanks for sticking around for this one, however much of it you actually heard before drifting off. Sleep well,